Good evening. It's my real pleasure and honor to welcome Leon Krier here to the Berlage Institute. It is within the lecture program which we composed together with Ilya Zengelis, the fabricators of the architectural ideologies. And when we start discussing the invitees for the program, I do remember that Ilya was saying we have to bring Leo here to discuss with us what he was actually doing, what was his actually architectural discourse in the 70s, 80s, and later. And it was perhaps one of the most visible, most vocal, and most charismatic, if I may say, critique on a kind of radical modernism, where he would engage in teaching, in practice, and in a theoretical development of the basis for the new architecture. I would invite Ilya Zengelis to talk a little bit more about it in a second, because Ilya and Leo has been together teaching and discussing the ideas and disagreeing, as far as Ilya would often put it, openly. But it was a kind of very intense mutual debate and very intense actually debate around AA and in other places. For my generation, if I may say, the generation which sort of graduated in the late 70s and the beginning 80s, Leon Krier was somebody who was really putting in front of us a kind of radical thinking, or shall we say radical rethinking, the way in which architecture goes, the way in which it relates to the history, the way in which it relates to something what actually perhaps we forgot while developing our various educations in various places in Europe. So once again, thank you for coming. The last time the nature of the Icelandic volcano stopped you, but now we are really pleased to have you here. So welcome to the Berlage Institute. And please, Ilya, would you like to put in front the frame in which we would discuss with Leon Krier today and tomorrow?
Well, for me, it is a special pleasure because this time in the series on fabricators of ideology, we have not only a very challenging person, but also a very great friend of mine. Leo, in fact, there is a misconception, I think, about Leo's reputation as hater of modernism. I think that, I would put it, from knowing him, the other way around. He's a hater of bad modernism. He's a hater of bad design. And because there has been so much bad modernism, he has thrived in his critique. But he loves everything well designed, everything of quality. And that is, his greatest strength, a kind of an advocate of quality. And we have, as Vedran said, kind of often disagreed in our discussions. But the discussions I've had with him have been, I think, the most challenging and most crucial ones that I've had, because our friendship bound us, so that it didn't matter that whether we argued. In fact, he gave me a book. A Krier book on architecture and urban design, dedicated to me, kind of with a dedication that said that in order to save a friendship and to provide to bridge a gulf of perennial incomprehension. So, but indeed, I think that there was not so much miscomprehension. There was a lot of crossing, but I won't take any more of your time. I'll ask Leo to come on.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here, and particularly to see my old friend Elia. I always say that classicists, they go to see modernist buildings on holidays, and modernists do the opposite. It was only Saturday I visited Corbusier's flat in Paris for the third time. I was shocked by the terrible state it is in. But it's a beautiful piece. Anyway, I think what we are talking about is that in the 70s, when Elia asked me to teach, I had absolutely no idea or theory at all. And he asked me to come to the A, and one day to meet students, and the group I was supposed to assist him on. And then I had never written a line nor spoken to anyone in public, and then suddenly he said, and Leo is now going to present you with the program he's doing next year. I was absolutely flabbergasted and speechless. And it went from there. You know, the first year was completely absurd. Projects cutting right across London with a single building plowing through the geography. No, the year later, yes, yeah. Zara had permanent hysterical crises, but she was a very good student, working very hard, and she was always there. She was also a good cat minder of my cat. But anyway, things were extremely confused, and they still are. And but it was when I lived in London and in Berlin and in faraway places from where I had grown up, and I got regularly a newspaper from Luxembourg, and every week, you know, this newspaper would come with a painting or picture or photograph or drawing of a very nice building, a park or tree or wall or something ancient I had grown up with, which had unfortunately to be condemned for some reasons of modernity and traffic efficiency and all that sort of thing. And then the day I saw a photograph of the park which surrounds the city of Luxembourg, I really got alarmed because it said park or parking. And of course, because the town center had been so changed that they needed huge amounts of car park, and they proposed to destroy entirely the park which surrounded 3/4 of the city and replaced by a big car park. That made me suddenly, I had so shock and started writing, and I did an alternative plan for Luxembourg, and it was published, and that led to all sorts of things. And a few months later, Elia asked me to teach, and so I began really to think how to communicate ideas, and usually the people I invited to lecture in that course I so disagreed with that I would start arguing, and so the second year I got my own unit, and I decided to do my own lectures, so there would be a real nice ideological fabrication, as you are calling it, which would be coherent. Because when I saw what was happening to my hometown, there was absolutely no theory you could call upon as a higher authority to bring into that town to save it. Because due to the new zoning plan which had been drafted by the president then of the Union of Architects, UIA, Pierre Vagot, who had completely revisited the zoning of the city and intrinsically condemning the historic fabric. And from there, to understand what was going on, took me many, many years. And I think that the real crux and the point which I think you can study and begin to understand is that there is a mistake to call traditional architecture historic. It's a philosophic mistake. What one does by calling traditional architecture and town planning historic, you automatically date it, and therefore it's over. It's like if you were historicizing the wheel, and because it had been something of the past, you could no longer use a wheel. And that is why I say we are not interested, I'm strictly not interested in the history of architecture, but in the technology of traditional architecture. And if you understand this technology, that it is related entirely to the physiology and the physical capacities of the human body in aggregates, in smaller or larger aggregates, using natural materials to build places. And if you understand that technology and its limitation, that traditional technology is related to natural materials, you will suddenly understand that you have a completely different understanding of modernism. Because modernism is that phenomenon which allows you to do architecture without natural materials. The synthetic materials which came about with the use of fossil fuel energies, creating new materials, synthetic materials, materials of synthesis, like concrete and steels and plastics, and all those materials, and also the fitting techniques which are going to allow you to do forms which before one was not able to do merely with natural materials. If you use brick, you have to use arches, or you can cantilever a certain amount of bricks. But if you want to build systematically in large places for large amounts of people, the arch or the traditional trabeation will come along as a matter, as an automatic thing. And there is no element of arbitrariness in architecture like there is in language. You know, what distinguishes between human languages because of regional differences and distances, you don't have in architecture, because natural materials, whether it's wood, stone, or clay, or earth, or sand, when you use them, you have, with your body and your instruments you develop to use these materials, you come to the same conclusions, to the same results. And that is why traditional architecture is universal. And it's not an ideology, it's a fact of life. I mean, if you want to use natural materials, you will automatically produce traditional architecture. And modernism can be done, but is extremely difficult to do with natural materials only, when you use natural materials structurally. So that's the premise. So don't think that I'm doing historicist architecture. I'm not interested in historicism as such. I mean, interested as a phenomenon, but not as a technique to design cities or places. So what is really fundamental in the change of architecture production and of human habitat, of the making of towns, is the discovery of fossil fuels and the large use of fossil fuels, the massive use, because there have been fossil fuels for as long as there has been humanity. But the large use which led to complete transformation of building materials, building sites, forms of settlement, daily lives, our own, the way we move around the planet. So it is basically fossil fuels which have caused this enormous change, and fossil fuels which are now coming to an end, because there are many disagreements when the peak oil will happen, but that it will happen, there's absolutely no doubt. So I think that my position is that in order to face that enormous change which will come about with extreme radical change in the availability of fossil fuels, one should really prepare for it. And it won't do to do green skyscrapers or to have sort of sustainability ideas as they are now circulated, because it's about sustainability issues as they are circulated now are industrial projects. They have nothing to do with ecology, very little to do. One saves a little energy, but it does not really face the problem of fossil fuel depletion. Now, the most radical book, and I think the most profound book you should read about fossil fuel problem, is The Long Emergency of James Howard Kunstler. Atlantic press. I think you should all read it. Most of you will go into crisis. I didn't sleep for 3 days, but there are people who can't sleep for 3 months. Yeah. Because it really shows how far you are dependent, how all our lives, our food, the way we live, is really dependent on fossil fuels. Now, what is going to happen, and where there is a misconception in the common mythology of fossil fuels, is that, we may be soon be short of fossil fuels, but then they will have something to replace it. There's something of equal validity and power. That is one myth, which is a fabricated myth which doesn't stand to inspection. The second one is that, yes, there will be an oil peak, but there will be a symmetrical figure. It took about 200 years from massive use of fossil fuels to peak, and then there will be another 200 years to run out, so our lives will be safe, we'll move about and go on holidays as we have been doing. And that is also a mistake, because once we reach the peak of fossil fuel extraction, and also of uranium extraction, of all those materials which now allow us to do what we do, there will be a complete change in our conception of progress and of growth. And the idea that there will not be permanent growth, we are now slowly getting accustomed to, that we are evening out, that there is no longer the 10% or even the 5% or the 1% growth, but that we may go into negative with growth. So how to pay for the accumulated debt, the national debt, if you don't have permanent growth? It's something the best economists will not solve, because they will just have to tell you there will be an enormous collapse of value and of heritage. And it's generally in those cases where the poor are going to pay for it. Because probably what happened to the Soviet Union is what into a modern so-called democracy is probably going to happen in most of our countries, that the wealth, what used to be sort of communist collective wealth, will be in very short time monopolized by a very, very small group of people, and the rest of the society will rot away. This is already happening now in the United States. If you know the United States and you travel across it, you do not just stay in New York. So there will be an enormous impoverishment of large sectors of population. And this will be right across the globe. Now, we know that modernist buildings don't anymore look like this. But the Baroque, the postmodern phase of modernism, and I include within postmodernism, is now used as an insult against those who try to do historicist architecture, as they call it. But really, all modernism as it's published now, or as it's built now, and it's perceived now, is postmodernist, because it's a reaction against the first phase of modernism. Nobody I have seen or know wants to reproduce Hilberseimer town, or even Corbusier's Ville Radieuse. Nobody, I've never seen that being reproduced anywhere, or certainly not by a sane person. So there has been a reaction, whether it's Peter Eisenman or Venturi or the New York Five. They react against the first phase of modernism because it was an unlivable proposition. It was a totalitarian vision of completely serialized and mechanized and cloned environment, which basically died with the totalitarian regimes. And now we are in the Baroque phase. Buildings go into funny, acrobatic and amusing shapes. And particularly, you can take any modernist building, you can put it upside down structurally, it will just stand up. Now that you cannot do with a traditional building. You put it upside down, it collapses. The arch doesn't work that way. And these are things which are absolutely simple things, which are not difficult to understand, and they are universal. And that is why I do not understand why it takes so long for these problems to really become analyzed properly and become dealt with. why there is this incredible fascination nowadays with skyscrapers, whereas when you analyze the skyscraper as a phenomenon, not just as an interesting solitaire, but as a way of building towns, is an absolute futureless form of building. And I will go through this why. But we basically, this is the typology of modern town building. Skyscrapers, ground scrapers, and sprawlers. These extremely small buildings which are repeated in enormous amount of quantities, cloned quantities, always making single-use zones of housing, education, production, consumption, and administration. So it's a collective form of production which produces very large, enormous buildings which are impossible to build with natural materials or maintain. They are also disregarding geography very largely. You build the same thing in Beijing or in Siberia or in Africa or in the Andes, and you keep it going with the machinery, with fossil fuel. And you have glass buildings, whether they are reasonable or not. You have buildings across the globe, independent of climate, culture, geography. It's essentially a cloned, mechanized architecture which is placeless, cultureless, geographyless, and it has absolutely no future. Now you may think that you like it. I like some buildings too. I love to have big windows, and it's not a matter of liking. And I know all the modernist buildings you know, and I appreciate some. I find this building is actually a very interesting building. My limit is 3 floors. Yes, you laugh. But if you have to walk every day more than 3 floors, 25 times, you will see what happens. You don't laugh anymore. I live now in Madrid on the 8th floor in a penthouse. And with my girlfriends, we walk every day 2 or 3 times just for exercise. And you don't need any bodybuilding machines anymore after that, because it's an enormous effort to walk every day 3 or 4 times, 8 floors. So they are not joking matters. We are so used to these mechanical machinery driven by fossil fuels or by nuclear fuels that we think they are natural, but they are not natural at all. It's biological energy which is now running out, and it's so interesting to call now biofuels. Fuels are biomatter. It's only very few mineral energies which can be used in a massive way. So it's an interesting idea that we're using these old life. Now this is what is generally called sprawl, which occupies vast regions, particularly in the most advanced industrial countries, particularly in America, and not so much in Europe, but you have it already now in large quantity. This is called sprawl, but I call also this sprawl. This is horizontal sprawl, and this is vertical sprawl. These residential zones generally are built as cul-de-sacs, as grapes, which are plugged onto a very large geographic circulation system. And these are exactly the same vertical replica. They are vertical cul-de-sacs. And they are stuck onto a matrix of services and circulation. But just think, if you build, we have now been doing this for 100 years. If you build towns that way for 1,000 years, let's say 2,000 years, every single building lot becomes a skyscraper. Just imagine what happens. So I'll get into more detail later, but see that scenario for yourself. So the idea of town has been developed over many, many generations, and a city is not just an amount of building. It is something which is a complex of buildings and spaces and uses which grow, which find a form throughout civilizations which have built cities, and particularly they have a limit. Once they reach that limit, they multiply. A large town becomes a number of small towns. Instead, what happened with modern towns is that the center overgrew vertically or overexpanded horizontally with the types of buildings which I showed before. Now, once you build something which is a real town, a real traditional town which has mixed use, mixed population, mixed income, a mix of private and public, and so on, you create such a powerful magnet of real estate, such an enormously increased value of real estate rather than agricultural or village environment, that of course money becomes an important element, value becomes an important element, and if you let these elements like overdevelopments in, they will sooner or later destroy the very quality of what you have been creating. Now, all people love New York, and I understand why, but that's certainly not the model for it. So I developed this idea of traditional town, which is a fabrication which was collaged with many ideas from historic towns, from old towns, from old theories and new theories, and particularly recent times, 19th century and 20th century, Otto Wagner, and Eliel Saarinen, which brought, and I formulated that as that in how far a large town would be a family of small towns, how many centers you need and how you structure it and how you phase it and so on. And basically that these dimensions of these small towns should be dimensioned on the human body, and that the maximum of walking distance across such a town would be 10 minutes. And it was what probably the center of Rotterdam was before the destruction by the Germans, or what all interesting and powerful historic towns have been throughout history and throughout civilizations, whether it's the Chinese town foundations or pre-Columbian foundations or medieval European foundations. And I thought once such a theory is properly published and developed and known, that it will become such a powerful element of politics that the suburban idea will be wiped out, because it's just morphologically and typologically and functionally it's an inferior model. It's just a sort of parasite on the body of society. Now, what is very important is that the production, how those elements are produced by crafts and arts, and those are produced by a result of industry. And that individual enterprise gets more and more suppressed in this form of scale. And what Karl Marx called that, in a way, extreme capitalism or the preparation for communism, because it's the large, enormous scale, mega family, beyond meta family scale, which is taking over. And not only taking over in fact, in distribution, in production, in military, in defense and societal organizations and education, but also in the minds, that there is a kind of a law, a love story with a mega scale, with a hyper scale, with enormous sizes, and a kind of, it's almost a religious experience for those people who are within that form of reverence. So I really understood made my theory on Luxembourg itself, because Luxembourg was a small capital city, and it had all the elements which you needed for a metropolis, which is a central town of a society. And what was happening to it was basically that what used to be a polycentric town was transformed into a single center, central administration with enormous roads cutting through it, and then reorganizing the territory in center and periphery, a business center and suburb. This is Corbusier's method applied to Luxembourg, where he used this diagram of the fluxes, which are these are the fluxes. As you have a central city, you have the greatest density of traffic in the center, and Corbusier said, yet that is where you have the narrowest streets. So you have to bring this over there and blast the thing apart. And Plan Voisin for Paris and then the Ville Radieuse were the response to this, which is a strictly logical response. Yet he was prepared to sacrifice Paris for this idea, which even Hitler didn't do. I mean, if you look at the Corbusier's plan for Paris, it was a monster. Just as the idea was monstrous. And yet Corbusier was one of the most sensitive and gifted and poetical persons you could imagine. And why he would do that? And that is what modern man is about, is sort of torn between longings and the feeling of devoir, how do you call it, of necessity and unavoidability. So this is what happened with a small city, large city, as a group of communities, and then being transformed in the 19th century by this complete change of networking and the use based on vehicles rather than animals and persons. Now, I use the term, and I published this book, which is called The Architecture of Community. It's not a sentimental idea. I don't think that the most important thing of community is that it's nice to be together. Of course, it's very nice. And when climate is nice, it's even better to be together. And that makes the fact that Mediterranean countries are much more sociable than the northern countries, because it's nice to be with people. But what is fundamental about community is that you have common interests, that it is the self-interest of the individual and the families which are shared by larger groups and which makes really the necessity of a town. So I think we are going to have to go back to this system of pedestrian horizontal and vertical systems. But whether they will be grouped as large metropolises or spread around the geography more related to the nutritional capacity of the soil, or the nature of the imperial nature of a town, or it's all these relations of politics, economy, agriculture, and then social models, which are going to decide, and on which there is almost no experimentation. And it's really up to a new generation to bring these kind of ideas, to make them scientific, because today, in order to take intelligent political decisions, there's almost no concepts and no materials for politicians to look at and to decide upon. So they are constrained to take decisions under the pressure of the body politic, to take immediate decisions about energy saving and lowering carbon footprints and all that. But they don't know. There are no facts, there are no statistical facts which allow you to take intelligent decisions. So it's a terrible situation to be in. But this system certainly will not work in the future. So I say that even if we have the fossil fuels, we should really plan as if we didn't have them and then use them. Of course, intelligently and probably a bit more moderately than we have them now, than we use them now. I show, because I did two major mistakes in my life. My career peaked in 1985, around. It was quite famous then, and well considered. And then I published a book on Albert Speer, which was not very well distributed, so people don't know what is in it. It will now be republished with an introduction of Robert Stern, which will be very, very interesting. To something being Jewish must be good, Bob said. Because it's a book not about the Nazis, but about us. What is so terrifying about studying the Nazi system is how close it was to ours. And it's not about, I think Albert Speer was a very good architect, but you are not allowed to say it because he was a killer. He was a huge criminal. And he escaped it just by chance because he looked good and he spoke very well. He didn't look like the criminals. He didn't have the criminal look of the common Nazi. But it is the extraordinary familiarity of the totalitarian systems, and our own, which we must study. It's about ourselves, and the book, I think, is a bomb, and it will, this time I will survive. So I published that and got targeted as a Nazi, a neo-Nazi. And then I started working for the Prince of Wales, which was another mistake, because as you know, the Prince of Wales is not exactly considered to be intelligent and forward-looking. And yet that is exactly what the man is. He's extremely intelligent, and he's clever, and he put his faith in my project, and we built it. And it is exactly because the project is so radical that it is so ill-considered by the architectural world. Norman Foster said on the BBC that Poundbury should be destroyed, like Cato saying about Carthago. Caterum censeo, Carthaginem esse delendam. So says Lord Foster about Poundbury. So you wonder what is so terrible about Poundbury. I now walk through that because it's the only project I've been able to realize more or less consistently, but not completely consistently. Because Rem Koolhaas said that today it's easy to do modernism, more or less. I think that's what he said. But to traditional building and town planning today is not easy at all. It's extremely difficult. It's considered to be easy. It's the easy way. But once you go that way, you will see that virtually every single law, every single building habit, the industrial patterns, the way a society works are almost impossible to realize nowadays in a consistent way. So this is the project which has now been building for 15 years. I've been planning it for about 20 years, since 1988. The first phase is completely built. The second phase is now being built out, and the third phase we are now permitting. And it is not routine yet. Now, Poundbury is situated outside the city of Dorchester on land which is owned by the Prince of Wales. All the suburbs of the city of Dorchester in Dorset have been built over the last 150 years on lands owned by the Duchy of Cornwall, of which the Prince of Wales is the head. And he said, when the district proposed this idea to build Poundbury, he said, yes, we'll of course do it, but we'll this time master plan it, not to be ashamed of it as he is of his precedents, just selling land and letting happen whatever happened. I mean, to become a responsible landowner, because, and I think it's through that and other projects of his that he's really giving legitimacy to a system, to royalty, which it had completely lost. I'm not a royalist, but I think that he's doing a very important job. So going back to a model of small towns with human scale. Now, human scale not understood as, again, as a sentimental thing, but something which is really strongly and physically and practically related to the capacity of the human body, which this form of a settlement is definitely not. Now, there's, when you have these mega densities in modern towns, as you have already here, and then this enormous sprawl, there is something which happens through this densification of fabric, of built mass, is that the real estate value becomes so high in these centers, and these centers become so important that virtually 90% of the urban population, which you need to have a real, a good city, are going to be exlocated and thrown into the suburbs. The mayor of Rome had recently a sociologist analyzing the situation of mobility, and he explained, I never heard a sociologue speaking sense, and this guy really got it. He analyzed the difference of how the wealthy and the poor and the middle classes, how much more dependent the poor are in relationship to mechanical means of transport than the wealthy, because we travel relatively comfortably and between comfortable places, but the poor really travel in sordid conditions nowadays, even in the best of towns. So it's this kind of zoning, social zoning effect, which is as toxic as the architectural zoning or the functional zoning. And you have to think, I think, what is your choice? If you design buildings, who are you working for? Who is your client? Who is your ideal client, and who is your real client? or what form of society do you want to support and what form of society you want to not to participate in. And we have a choice. You don't have to do skyscrapers or to build these vast buildings. There's a lot of, at least we have the capacity to survive in this very multifaceted society. So it's not only limiting horizontally the size of districts, but also vertically. So it's walkability horizontally and vertically. Now, Poundbury itself will be an independent town, separate from the historic building of Dorchester. On the western edge, Dorchester was founded by the Romans, had about 30 hectares, population of about 5,000. It's the city which is beautifully described in Thomas Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. That is the maximum size I use for these districts. Some can be smaller, but they will not be larger. Now, the first phase was an extension of the existing suburbs, completing these suburbs and giving them a center. Between now these large blocks of towns, these large cells, communal cells, then form spaces in between them, which are either used for agriculture, for sports, or parks for leisure and education. So you have a setup of a geographical grid which relates to how people use the town. Within each of these districts, you have local uses. You have virtually everything, and that is the ideal. We don't build ideals, but that is the principle. And we are not always able to achieve it, but at least we set up the principle that your daily uses, your daily needs are satisfied within each of these. Your weekly uses within the larger conglomerate. These are buildings which are related to the district or the region, or large schools are in between and so on. But children can walk up to 10 or 20 or even 30 minutes, but always in urban situations. I grew up in Luxembourg, and until I was 20 years old, I never used the bus. We only used the bus when there was a nice girl in it, not because you needed to. It was a very nice walk across town. So it's that experience which I think history is not over. People think, oh, but that's the past. No, most of us have that experience of having lived at some point of life, of having had that experience of proximity, and how precious proximity is when you can use it. That is the final build-out. We have completed this, and this is now we are finishing this, and so on. And then extending here. And the highest point, geographic point, is here, and that is where the most important buildings will be, like a tribunal, a regional tribunal, and so on. And these axes, these visual cones and visual patterns have not only give interesting spaces, but also locations for buildings which are important or less important. So there's, even if this looks romantic, it is the foundation is rational, and I'll go through that why. So you have polycentricity, and then each of these small towns has a clearly identifiable edge, which is not just an administrative limit, but also a geographically experiential limit. You can walk or drive or crawl or whatever. These blocks are like buildings, and it is incredibly satisfying to have small visible units which are larger than a building block or than large building groups, but which really make towns. I lived it myself in Luxembourg, because Luxembourg by nature had been cut by deep canyons. You have this experience in Malta or many other places where you have this necessity, and you can see there that a large town can work as a group of small towns. It's also what works still in Paris as the quartier system and arrondissement system, that you have relative local autonomy and yet a larger regional government. So it's centrality and a clear edge. And then these different quarters have their own center, and their own central square is linked to the main square by a distance of about 5 minutes too. So you have multi-layer of this 5-minute radius which creates a town. Now, these central squares are then linked by high streets which form the backbone of that, and you have within that procession which goes back into the center, you built a geographic infrastructure. Now, through traffic, of course, is taken out of these districts, and this was an enormously difficult political process to get that road built, because we don't have the status of a new town. We just have, the Prince of Wales has to make money by developing this town. It's not a philanthropic project. And he is making a lot of money with it, actually more money than if he had just sold it in one contract to developers. So you have this hierarchy of spaces which also relate to the hierarchy of traffic. These are self-evident things, but they need to be repeated because they are not self-evident today. These dark spots are places of employment, individual or larger groups of employment, whether it's public or private or mixed. And you see that there is no employment zone. These buildings are built right across the districts, but with a certain logic, which I will explain later. This is a form of modern development. Very large sites, hundreds and hundreds of acres, are sold to single large developers who build hospitals, houses, university campuses. And it's the economy and the management of public funds or private funds which all collude to form these very vast uniform developments, which you have so plentiful here in this country, where you have this mix of public and private interest. I remember driving in somewhere near The Hague, like for half an hour, in very crawling traffic. It was like 2 miles of building development, exactly the same buildings. Big courtyards with the tower on the corner. I think they must have occurred 16 times, same signature. So if you live in building block number 1 or number 17, you actually have to tag your door in order to understand where you are. This doesn't occur in these developments because each place, each street, each house is individually designed and creates a unique location. That is the way, after all, nature works, because even though we are typologically and morphologically and structurally the same, we have our own individuality and singularity. The traditional development is that you have different forms, different sizes of lots, large, very large, medium size, and very small or tiny, built, shaped in the form of blocks which form good public space, and they are for not only of different sizes, but for different ambitions, different functions, different uses, and symbolically different buildings, whether they are public or private. And this is like a matrix for managing rivalry, violence, all those elements which, when they go out of control, like in these enormous developments, can create permanent civil war if it is generalized. We had a few examples of that 3 years ago in France, where they had this enormous conflagration of burning cars and buildings and libraries. And you wonder what will happen if they come burning the buildings in the centers. Now, this has happened only in the suburbs in France. Last year, 42,000 cars were burned in France in the suburbs. Can you believe such a quantity of cars? And I'm not making it up, these are public figures. So it's a violence which is created by these completely unthinking meta-human scale. This does not mean that these will be all nice people. People are as nasty and nice and as they have always been. But it's a form of management of social violence. It's a matrix. It's like the law, which allows you to behave properly. Now, the variety of architecture within Poundbury is when you have a large building, it's not because the architect liked to do large buildings or had a kind of sexual arousal because he loves to do big buildings, but because they are needed. This is an industrial building. Whereas this is a clinic or an old people's home or shops and so on, they have the size they need for their functions. And so the variety, the architectural variety, comes out of the functional variety and is a natural result of functional variety. So the master plan really is like a matrix which is not so much prescribing what's going to happen there, but allows different activity, different people who buy different sizes of lots to develop their activity within an urban compound. So it's not master planning, it's not something you do like this and then you say, fiat, now it will be executed. No, it's something which needs to be managed over many, many years in order to make sense. So we avoid this like hell, to have the same kind of activity in the same corner, but we always checkerboard functions. And so the zoning plan is really a polycentric figure. Now you have short spaces. Within each quarter you have relatively short spaces. You can't speed in short spaces. Only fools do that. Whereas where we want to speed up traffic, we have large spaces. Now, in suburbs, you have these enormous spaces where you have then to put in bumps and signs and traffic limitations because the design is not adequate for the use. Whereas here we don't have any signage at all in Poundbury. We have some which we can't avoid. I mean, like defending to drive. It's completely, the few signs which are there are put there by nonsensical people. But the towns should really be designed in such a way that it allows a civilized behavior for whatever is required in that location. Now, each block has an English muse inside, which was so well done in England for vehicles and for horse carts and so on. And we use the muses for garages so that the permanent parking for the houses are behind in muses and the visitors parking are in the street. In each of these muses there is always one or two houses in order to not to have too much purely dedicated to traffic or sleeping traffic. And I thought also that by having some houses within the blocks you would have a form of social, not only social control but also lower values, lower real estate values next to factories or within courtyards, parking courtyards. And so that you allow a great variety of income to live next to each other, because it's this interdependence of incomes within the same district and block which I think makes a real power of traditional urbanism. And not because they are planned to be so, but because that's the way it happens. It didn't always work like intended, because actually some of the houses within the muses have become the most valued properties. So the building block is not just a perimeter block like you have them so many in Holland, but it's a much more complex. There are, of course, some perimeter blocks where they are needed and always multifunctional. So you have this higgledy-piggledy image is not because it's nice, but it makes sense. And it is nice in the end. This suburban model, you have always an oversized lot with the building isolated in the middle, and then the extensions always make the despair of the architect who had this Platonic ideal. Whereas a traditional building is always put there where it makes more sense to create a frontage with the street, and then you build around the site, privatizing the site, whether it's a house or factory or, or monastery, a school or anything. Now, just to give you an idea, that part of a building was a farm and a stable. It was transformed into a civic center in the beginning of the project, and then became a business center, and that was a high-tech factory, which then was sold, and the firm went back to America, and it became a school, a kindergarten for 100 children. And these courtyards, which had been planned for heavy goods vehicles to circulate, are now used as kindergarten. And this to say, no, Lord Rogers, who is so thinks that because things are modern and they move a lot, and things have always moved around towns. Towns are something organic. It's not just dead matter, but things move. And it's not because buildings are built in masonry or wood that they are not moving. And it's within 20 years or 15 years of use, this has changed occupation 6 or 7 times without major changes to the structure. So mobility is not just a matter of moving cranes and so on. Large buildings, if these are these different quarters, large buildings you don't put right in the center. You always have on the edge where they need to be, if they are factories or large administrative buildings or schools, where they have access or buses or heavy goods vehicles. Now, if you analyze the most advanced park, science park in England, Stockley Park, done by Rogers and Rice and whoever the architects are, but they are the most high-tech buildings and uses in England. And if you compare them in size to historic towns, you see that they are rather small. They're also, they control their emissions by law. They are not noisy. Stockley Park is quieter than suburbs when football is blaring, you know, and pop music is coming out of the windows. So that is why these buildings can be and should be integrated within the urban fabric. Now, because we have been doing that, the many people who live in Poundbury now, I think about over 2,000, and there are over 2,000 jobs there. And this cannot be planned. You just let it happen. You cannot, because we don't have that sort of authority. And if you mix it, people will naturally want to find a house where they work. That is not possible in contemporary suburbia. It's beyond a pedestrian's reach. And you see this enormous variety of building sites, which illustrates what I said before. You have also some parking courtyards that was supposed to be clinic. It became those people's home, and it has a location which is very important because it forms the gate to the first phase. And of course, there are some higher buildings, but they are not more than 5 floors. So we have mostly the building fabric is 2 to 3 floors, and then some emerging buildings because they are in an important location or because they have an important use. This is the town edge of the first phase, forming a promenade along the park, the central square of the first phase, and in this location will be built a tower, and the village hall and the market. It's cut of traffic. Traffic is allowed, but except for the time when there's public markets and so on. And these markets, that's a village hall designed by John Simpson. And you see also architecturally, this is still not high classicism, it's rather a peasant type emphasis on, it's a village hall, because it's in a small square of not the most important district. Whereas the most important buildings up on the major square, on Queen Mother Square, on the highest point of the hill will be, or are now designed and built by Queen and Terry, which are of a higher architectural ambition. So this to make the point that variety is not because you like it. It's not, you do not add an element of complexity into something which is fundamentally simple. But the complexity is the illustration of a complex situation. And you have building blocks with a single door because that's the way it works. If it's a factory, you don't need many doors. Or you have building blocks with many, many doors because they are small units. And it's the contrast of these grand and modest scales which make the town. We have an architecture which becomes more and more formal as we go towards the center, more classical, more emphasis on the proportions, more regularity. And even though they look the same, each of these buildings is actually individually designed. Each block is traversed by these small passages, and so you have large spaces, small spaces, and all integrated in a consistent fabric. Now that is if you look at the traditional town, the public buildings are distributed throughout the town and usually related to squares, whereas streets are normally to do with residence or with industry. And it's the mixture of this economic element and the symbolic element which really makes a powerful mix. Now, architecturally, that is the reign and the area where vernacular is applied in traditional towns, whereas high classicism or more formal architecture, more ambitious architecture, architecture done with more precious materials is related to institutions or buildings which are of greater import or which have to do with a collective importance. And it is this mix of private and public which I think makes the power of traditional towns. Now, I lived for 20 years in a village in France where there was no architecture. It was just walls, stone walls with nice cornices and a few tiles on the roofs. And the only columns you found in town were inside the church, around the tabernacle. But you can be very happy. It was a beautiful place when they're surrounded by beautiful countryside. So grander architectural schemes are really needed when you have larger groups, when you have larger towns, when you have uses which have not just to do with local use, but which have to do with collective representation or collective values, whether they are of a moral or political character. And of course, as always with human development, things go from the very simple to excess. And the tendency in the 19th century was to have, even Adolf Loos joked about the architect even designing the slippers for the lady of the house he had designed and prescribes exactly where she had to use it and not use it and so on. And it's this form of tyrannical classism, I think, and completely over-coded classism and abuse of classism, which led also to its final collapse because it becomes suffocating. It's impossible to teach well because it doesn't really make sense anymore. And modernism came in as a rejection of this excess. Now, what I find intriguing, and I have the same feeling, I have rather a modernist taste. My house is just white walls, no artwork, and just books. No. I can't stand too many artworks in a house. But it's this extraordinary, when there's an overproduction of something, that there's rejection. And yet we only have that rejection, that generational rejection, this revolt, this sudden revolutionary spirit in the arts was completely ignored by engineers. Why were they not fed up with Victorian teaching? No, engineering is still being taught today with Victorian methods. It's extremely tyrannical, or doctor's education is absolutely unbearable. But it has not led to revolt. And why it happened in architecture it would be an interesting thesis to do as you are all involved in thesis production. So this is showing diagrammatically where important locations are and where architectural elements of classical elements would make sense. We limit building heights not metrically, because this limitation has always led to great boredom. When you have always cornice height limitation, forces developers to have as many low floors as possible to pack in as much surface as possible. If you limit it by number of floors, you can have even skyscrapers, which the Campanile in Florence is 5 stories high, but it's 100 meters high. And it is this natural difference between whether it's a public palace or whether it's a workshop or a house or a factory, which leads naturally to a varied skyline. High ceilings and low buildings, whereas this is high buildings with low ceilings. Somebody once got up at a lecture of mine and said, what about the romance of building high? And I said, just go analyze these buildings inside. How low. There's no city where ceilings are as low as in Chicago. And the monumental potency of building high is actually in inverse proportion to the number of its floors. These have no story. This has 1 story, and this has 3 stories. And most real monumental buildings are 1-story high skyscrapers, like St. Paul's Cathedral and so on. I'm talking against Manhattanism as a phenomenon, not so much about Manhattan, but against the phenomenon, because once you go over that scale, the physiologically natural capacity of the human body, once you go over that, you exceed that, not only horizontally, but also vertically, money becomes so important, becomes the dominant factor in building, that architects in the end just design the entrance and do some frills on the facade, and the rest is done by the engineers or somebody different. Now, it's generally done so badly. The new towers, which are now built by in Madrid, you know, these 4 skyscrapers, they are guaranteed for 25 years. Can you believe doing buildings of such importance guaranteed for 25 years? Which means that after 25 years, they will be entirely, except the support structure, will have to be stripped down. The surface is renewed, the facades probably reclad, and so on. And in that sense, money, or in that logic, money is so important that architecture will become less and less important. So the higher the buildings go, the less the architecture is important, except for some symbolic buildings where there's no limit to cost and you know, where the lords of the architectural world can do their follies. But it is something which is of no interest to the common architect, because very few architects ever will have to design skyscrapers, and that is why you shouldn't defend skyscrapers. I think it is a good proposition to oppose skyscrapers on principle. First of all, because they don't need ideological protection. They are everywhere. You can't avoid them. And they are menace to towns. And second, because I think it's actually wrong to do them, because once you think about them, it's an overloading of an existing networks. And you could, of course, design skyscraper city, but the infrastructure would have to be so monumental that they can only be imperial centers, centers of imperial power, of extremely brutal regimes. So this is not to be against high building. We also have some high buildings in important locations. That was a painting by Carl Lobin before building started. It's extraordinary how close it was in feeling. I have now gotten this tower through, which will be built on the main square, on the highest position to form like the main logo, the main symbol. Because once you build a traditional town, you have this horizontal expanse and you feel the absolute necessity to have some vertical accents, but they shouldn't be utilitarian skyscrapers. Now, this is about how these things are done. We impose on the facade the only use of natural materials, not only for looks, these are real structural walls, but above all for structure. And if you use natural materials, structurally, you produce authentic traditional building. It only becomes fake when you clad, when everything is like here, all these traditional towns which are built in Holland, it's all 1 inch thick. Traditional building. It's basically fake. Now, I'm not so much against it, because everything you do today is linked into that production of fakes. But in order to do fake well, you need to be extraordinarily competent and extraordinarily tyrannical, because you have to be there all the time. They get it wrong naturally. Whereas when you let them build, when you let artisans build this without too much control, they get it right automatically, because they develop their own intelligence, their own taste, and above all, their own skills. And it ages extremely well. It ages so well that owners are extremely worried, because buildings look like historic after 10 years of being exposed to Dorset rain. No. So now they want to wash their houses and have them painted with impregnable paint and so on. So, to do a house with windows and a door and a roof is not a simple thing. It's not simpletons who have done this in the past. It's intelligent people like you and me. They were very clever. And the invention of the window and the door and the house is an extraordinary invention. So you don't need to reinvent the window and the house and the door and the roof. It doesn't make any sense. We do not invent languages. Languages are established, and particularly universal languages like architecture. So the real problem you encounter once you go that way is not modernism at all. It's this kind of thing. The way the shutters are nailed to the wall, because who cares? I mean, you don't need shutters now, you have air conditioning. If you close them, you have the balustrade or the tiroir architrave, which prevents you to do that. Everything is fake. The walls, the elements, and in the end, people are fake. You know, when they live in this sort of fake thing, and their desires become fake. It's what René Girard calls metaphysical desires. They don't feel the need anymore. They don't have hunger for the real thing, but they have hunger for the fake. And that is where we are in a situation of extreme pathological suffering, because you can't reform this system. But you can do this well nowadays, you know, the real thing. So people say, why don't you ask Lord Foster to do the market, your market hall? So I say always, well, love is a reciprocal thing. It's not worth loving someone who is not loving you. And so if he asks us to design buildings in his schemes, we will certainly offer reciprocity. But the important thing was to demonstrate that this is possible to do, because it was said that politically, economically, financially, traffic-wise, you won't find the client, it won't be possible. And now that it's built, they say it's irrelevant. And that is the extraordinary thing, that once you actually disprove that all the theories against it have been disproved, they say it's irrelevant. But on the other hand, that's the way. We have enormous amount of people who love to live there, who choose to come there. And I say that we should really be in an experimental phase where we could design, because it's absolutely sure that traditional urbanism is superior to modernist urbanism. It won't survive the next fuel crisis, modernist urbanism. Traditional urbanism is a superior category, I mean intellectually, theoretically, and practically. And one day I'm going to do a small modernist town. Elia, we should do one together. Because I'm absolutely certain that one can do it. But the modernists have not done it so far. Because where is there an example of modernist town, completely coherently modernist, which would have a quality of the traditional towns? I have visited them all. And I love Miami Beach, but Miami Beach is a traditional town. And, but I think that with that language, one could actually do something which will be of interest. I'm now showing some projects I've actually built, and then it will be over. This is a gift to the American nation, because with this single idea, you know that when you drive across the United States, the villages, you drive through the villages, you never know where is the center and where is the periphery. It's just a crossroads where you have a few shops and the church and so on. And just by reforming that single thing, you could change the United States of America into an urban society. And that is happening by taking out a crossroads and making two T-junctions, T and T, and focusing on an important building, whether it's a town hall or a church, related to a market. Now, you have a lot of crossroads in America which are abandoned, petrol stations or sites which are not occupied, and very soon we'll have an experiment standing, and then it will spread from there. The architecture I do is always done with partners who are local partners who, in this case, Tagliaventi, who was in Italy. And I control the architecture at the 100 scale and then do some detail, but generally I lose the control because I don't like to go to building sites. And sometimes I get full control. And I recently discovered how that can be done without too much pain. This is a church in Florida in a scheme designed by, master planned by Andres Duani and Liz Plater-Zyberg. And that's what I got closest to what I wanted to do. That's a house I designed for myself in France before the books moved in and the pianos, with real stone and brick and so on. That's a museum in Portugal designed with two Portuguese classicists, where a museum is divided in small, it's an archaeological museum near Sintra, where the library or the pottery collection or the theater and so on, the medals, are all situated in different buildings. This is an architecture center at the University of Miami, which was built, but where I lost control of the detail, unfortunately, because the administration was dead against it. And because when too many people are involved in a building site, it becomes absolute torment, and you only see the mistakes. It's very good when you don't have your glasses on. That's a project done with Yamshid Seperi in Cyprus. And that's the book I'm wanting to sell you. Because the French say, to get 80%, you spend 20 amount of your energy, and to get 100%, you don't have enough energy to get the last 20%. And that's, in a way, what architecture is now about. It has become such a difficult job, and it's so far away, I think, from the traditional occupation of the architect, who was really a mastermind. An architect only makes sense if he got something which the craftsmen don't have. And it's not because we are superior, but we have something which the others don't have. And when you make a drawing and you have a great craftsman who really looks at it and gets it, it's a fantastic feeling because he needs you. And he's going to recognize the quality. The problem is that architects have now become sort of minor technicians who have to design every screw and every location of every screw, and they never get the screw right. And they go nuts like the architect in Jacques Tati's film Playtime, who is measuring everybody. No. He's measuring the walls and the people, and nothing works ever according to his measure. But it is, when you work in a traditional system, you really design with ideas which are practical, and you find the most satisfying aesthetic form for it, and you will be recognized for it. I work now with a man who managed my own house, the building site, and which was a pain, because I didn't have the right craftsman. But he finally put it right, getting the right craftsman, and we did the house in the last 9 months, which was extremely complex. I worked on it for 3 days, just with sketches. They had my details from the house before, and the house was built to, I have a 95% satisfaction rate, just doing sketches. And I think that is how architects used to work. They did not draw detailed, how the screws line up and how every insulation panel has to be set. That is the knowledge which the craftsman must have if you do buildings which are going to last and stand around and age well. So this is something, we are in democracy, thanks God, and this is something which is not against the law. You can practice, it's not easy, but it's certainly worth studying. And even if you become modernists, or if you are profoundly modernist, I'm sure you do better buildings if you know this system, how to tune and how to locate and how to plan good urban spaces. And I think that modernism could be improved. My last semester at Yale, I had one of the 10 students was allowed to do a scheme, which I master planned, but he was allowed to use Corbusier as the language. Not only to classify it, but also to tune it, to do public building and then 7 private mixed-use buildings. And became extremely interesting because I think what is the problem with modernism is that it was such a new language because of the synthetic materials that even the masters didn't really master the language. They had sort of intuitions, and there are some masterpieces like the Villa Savoye and the Barcelona Pavilion, and there are a few real extraordinary buildings produced by modernism. But they're always small. I have never seen a great big modernist building, maybe except the Cité Radieuse, the Unité of Le Corbusier. But those are unique buildings which you cannot replicate. It would create an absolute monster of a town if you just had towns built that way. So this is just an invitation. And thank you for your welcoming and your attention. I'd love to be here. And I love this building.
Did you get some questions?
Yes, of course.
So, Leon Krier, thanks a lot for your presentation and your kind of continuous belief in a certain paradigms, actually. And when one looks to your diagram of the sort of disappearance of fossil fuels and going back towards something what happened before, perhaps 100 years, how do you sustain this belief? How you believe that a kind of new paradigm would not come in front, that actually a kind of a historical paradigm which you would link with the physiology of the people to a certain extent, so with a lot of arguments which was in the core of your lecture. Do you really not believe in a kind of perhaps new paradigms which could come not necessarily from the industry or new materials, but from a kind of the ways in which societies has been kind of historically developing?
Well, I think we can't foresee what will happen, but what I'm absolutely certain is that it won't be a high-tech future.
Right.
There will be some high-tech machinery, there's absolutely no doubt, but that will be, I think that will be like in the past. High-tech will be for very few people. If you look at the Middle Ages, the arms in the Middle Ages were extremely sophisticated. And a sword, stainless steel, produced stainless steel in the Middle Ages, or the kind of armory they wore, was just for extremely rich people. And I think that's going to be the picture with high tech, but it will certainly not be that the whole world population will have forever photovoltaic cells on their roofs. Because virtually that's why this book of Künstler, James Howard Künstler, The Long Emergency, you can't get it here. It's so fundamental because it shows in how far we are dependent on this. And in how far all the speech about the alternative is fantasy and just mythology. I mean, it's hopeful, wishful thinking. But even if that wouldn't happen, even if we had forever, if there was absolutely no shortage of fossil fuel, I think it would be important to go back to the scale of functions. You know, whether you have fossil fuel or not, whether you are rich or poor, you need to eat more or less the same thing in order to have a healthy metabolism. And I think it's the same for architecture. And I think this hyperscalar building is to do with imperialism. And the most toxic side, the most dangerous side of imperialism. I mean, because these buildings, they cannot be maintained without having enormous military power, bringing the oil and the machinery and we are running short on that because it's no longer, first of all, it's no longer socially doable unless we change our mentality and we become again imperialists. But now people are generally, they think they are nice. Yeah. We don't want the Africans and the Arabs to suffer because we need our machines. And so people feel ashamed a bit of it. But it's an absolute fact. Some people say it's not, there's a joke saying that it's not our fault if our oil is lying under Iraqi soil in there. But they are bad jokes. It's real bad.
Thanks. Your questions to Leon Krier or comments? Yeah.
Thank you. I really don't know how to start. First of all, I was just passing through. I came from Portugal. I now I go to Portugal tomorrow, and I was visiting Rotterdam, and then I passed here in the street to see Berlage Institute, and there's Leon Krier in lecture. I must say that this is an accident, but it's a good accident. I read some of your books some time ago, and I, of course, understand what your thinkings, your in your lecture very well. I came from a country where historic city it's still there, and because of the lack of economic or not so development as in Central Europe, we still have the city there and the traditional buildings, and nowadays more or less than we used to have because they are being destroyed. So this to say that a year ago I opened my little office in Portugal, and one of the things that I stopped doing is buying magazines. Because once in a while I do like some visual forms that I see there, but actually I think mainly they all make no sense. And one of the things it's because of this thing of the fossil fuels and other questions about it. And it's I don't think architectural magazines, it's about architecture. They are all about magazines, selling magazines, which is not my interest, because I really like architecture. So one of the things that I would ask to you, I do understand your thoughts very deeply. I think there were several modernists like Alvar Aalto and Eero Saarinen, and I think I can consider Alvaro Siza one of them also, that think modernism, or they understood that modernism, as Corbusier put it, was lacking in something, probably in the scale or in the humanism of making architecture, which was possible because of the new materials, so big and so among us that the human body feel that, and they tried to make a response. I think they tried to make a modernism with a sense of humanity, which I think you do too. What I don't understand, it's nowadays, how can we see your work and not asking, that's a 20-year project, which I assume it has been a great effort to you, and it's been consuming a lot of energy. But how can we do that as architects when we have sometimes 20 hours to make a project? Or maybe 2 months. We don't do it. I would like to ask you.
You need a good client. You need the client. That's the most important thing, because you need the right client who wants exactly what you want, and that it makes sense to be able to sell it or use it. That is today very, very difficult. In all my life, I may have had 3 or 4 clients who really liked what I do, and you need to be respected for what you are good at. Now you need to be a genius in politics and in manipulation and in all sorts of things in order to do your métier, and that's why it's done so little, or why it's done so badly generally, because the market sells fake traditional. Everything is traditional here, traditional there. In America, virtually all house developments are so-called traditional, but it's all junk. It is not worth the material which has been invested in it. And so I think it's because the architect has really has become like a mastermind over a process rather than of buildings. And we basically don't play the role we should use, which is to do with form and with the elegance of solution, which is something the craftsmen don't have. But the real craftsmen, they know how to build a roof, they know how to build an arch, they know how to do all the techniques they have learned. But they can't fit it together, and that is what the architect is about, to make sense in an overall picture. I think today that the way our society is organized and the way things are financed and doesn't work that way. And so it's not really. I mean, I choose very early on not to build. I declared high and loud, I do architecture because I didn't build. Because I thought I worked for 4 years with Sterling, and to see the poor result of the buildings built with so much effort to me was like a shock. How can you make such effort for 4 or 5 years, and then in the end the buildings are badly put together, badly executed, and even badly designed? Because every building was like an innovation, and you can't. Building is not about innovation. It's about doing good building. And now there's an obsession with innovation, and which has been taken over by fashion, and the branding of architecture. And it's some people do it very well because they are very gifted and they're extremely astute. But it's meaningless for the overall production of. When you look at what's happening in the large mass of building, is just absolutely horrendous. There's nothing to be joyful about.
It was a question here, or somebody? Yeah.
Thank you for very interesting lecture. I understood you are clearly that criticizing this modernism, not modernism, but high-rise typology, modernism typical typologies. But do you think that there's no possibility to learning from these kinds of typology for our generation? We needed to really go back to this traditional style kinds of designs.
Well, I think it's important to realize that that modernism is really a product of synthetic materials. That is one thing, and then not makes a distinction because and judge traditional architecture because it's historic to be matter of the past. I do not say that you should do traditional architecture. You do what you want. Anyway, I don't have an authority to impose anything, and I don't want to impose anything. But I think it's a system which is important to know. Even if you do want to do modernism, you need to understand how natural materials are fitted, because you will actually Mies van der Rohe was a great traditional architecture before he became modernist, and it is certainly that sort of discipline which informed a lot of his ideas. And I think Mies van der Rohe went really bad when he did big buildings because he didn't know how to add modules. There was just an addition of modules. You can make a Photoshop manipulation of the Seagram building, fatten it, narrow it, heighten it, makes no difference. Just a multiplication of the same module, which has no grander scale. Whereas Corbusier, he designed buildings as an object. You cannot extend endlessly the unité. It's really composed with beautiful proportions, and it works visually. It's very, very, very powerful. But it's the awareness what you are working in, and not to say because it's we have to be modern. Having to be modern is like we have to live. No, it's a platitude. We cannot not be modern. Whatever we do is modern. But we don't have to be modernist. Because modernism is a style. It's a style of buildings with synthetic materials. And you should be able to choose between those. The technology of building is not just technology of synthetic materials, but technology is the science and the knowledge of techniques, which includes traditional techniques. And the theories of modernism are generally more to do with politics than they have to do with building. And when they expand into theories of conservation, which is now a nightmare, everywhere you go, beautiful historic buildings are being wrecked by idiotic mixture of techniques using concrete. I saw yesterday a beautiful castle in Luxembourg modernized with concrete. And it's completely idiotic because that concrete is going to destroy the wall. It's a very unstable material which goes very unwell with the load-bearing walls. And so it's to really have that considered as technology and not like ideology. And then do your modernist buildings. I mean, for instance, this building I find very interesting, extremely elegant, has a lot of memories of early modernism. But he tried to resolve it in a more permanent way, to have better detailing so the cornices don't fall off and the usual problems with this stripped down modernism. But for instance, this building would be much better if it was only 2 or 3 floors high. And I have my students do that. I have them take buildings, put them on computer and then manipulate them. Use that material and do different compositions with it. And to get a sense of distance from, it's not because it's historic and done by a great architect that's necessarily a great building or a perfect building. It's so to desacralize I think, historiography.
Would you say that the role of the architect should not change? Would you say that the role of the architect should not change?
Yes, yeah. Go back to to become again architects rather than trying to play everybody's role. And you see it now that the suspicion which is on building sites with architects, they come and people laugh, because to cantilever shapes for no reason is not considered to be great wisdom. Now, cantilevers you need for cranes and for war machines, but not for to have a museum to cantilever just because it's a nice shape. It's completely doesn't make sense. And that is why architects are generally now, because they are not respected, or they lost control, they are now back, the star architects are now back into kind of pre-civilizatory mysticism. They are considered to be divine. They are geniuses. Everything they do is a piece of genius. Now, Lord Foster's building in X place must not be stopped because otherwise we kill a masterpiece. And we'll be like stopping Van Gogh from painting another painting. And so it's this form of mysticism which is now, it's enormously respected. It's like football. Football heroes, they earn colossal amounts of money just for kicking a ball. When we earn a normal salary, they become jealous. So the role of the architect is so undermined because the architect has been so ridiculed and so unconvincing in common sense terms that now one has to play this role of being inspired. No, I have done a building which is like spaghetti. No. Why? Why should a museum be like spaghetti? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Or why should buildings be like roads? And that is, when you analyze all the postmodernism which is now around, from all the stars, they're all derivative. And then claiming it their own, making their brand. Like they have, Aldo Rossi has invented the square window. Just look around. I mean, there have been square windows for millions of years, as long as the people have been making windows. But he made so many square windows that the square window become his signature. Or twisting buildings become suddenly a personal thing. Whereas when you look at how history developed, there have always been these things. And there is people have forgotten that Herzog and de Meuron were assistants of Aldo Rossi. They speak as if they had invented architecture. And everything they do is derivative, is not innovative. Usually the derivations come from other techniques, from military, from car design, from road design, from the stuff which they put in walls. It has been done along motorways and retaining walls for years. But then when you use it for a shop, it looks like an innovation. It's not an innovation. It's just like a misuse of a technique which is makes perfect sense to retain earth, or because it's cheap, you bring it in lorry and you don't have to build a wall. But is just an interesting trend for signing a building, but it is not an innovation. So there needs to be a lot of historiography done on the quotes, on the origins of what is being done now, and kind of demystification. Because the architects don't invent anything. They take everything. I mean, even engineers don't invent anything. If you know the history of military engineering or aeroplane design, they have their references in nature. The Blackbird, SR-71, fastest plane on Earth. You think it's completely new, but then you look through nature and you find these forms in deep-sea fish. Why? Because they encounter similar problems of penetration of an element. But it's this mystification of innovation, which is in fact not true innovation, which is now has turned architects into everyone who wants to be Picasso. I mean, including myself. I'm not excluding myself from it. I suffered and still suffer from the same thing.
Perhaps the final question.
Just a quick question. You put a lot of emphasis on the material and the use of materials, and you base a lot of your architecture in the end on this use. So I'm wondering how you really define this term synthetic material, because for me it's not really clear why a brick is less synthetic as concrete, for example.
Mm-hmm. Well, brick can be locally produced, and whereas concrete not. If it's locally produced, it's usually to do with very large political and financial schemes in order to produce concrete. Concrete is not a local material. The Roman concrete could be produced locally because it's really a crafty job. But modern concrete is a high-tech material, even if it's used now in a banal way. But it's an extremely precious material, which needs a very sophisticated industry, unbelievable amount of investment. Can you believe in France in 1946 there was a ministry of Ministère du Béton? It was not a joke. Because concrete, these synthetic materials need very large-scale investments, and so you have to. And I have to use. Sorry.
Otherwise, you need slaves. That's the other.
Yeah, it's a form of slavery. Yes.
Maybe your architecture needs slaves.
No, because we use slaves. No, it's no joke. If you go to uranium mines in Ghana or wherever they are, they use slave labor. And our system, which is so polite here, is extremely violent. And it is good to know that all these materials we use are not innocent materials. That does not mean that I don't use concrete. If I want to build, we use concrete. But in that sense, because otherwise you don't build. And you use bolting techniques, which are generally, but at least for the external wall, I try to impose. I do not always win, because the industry is so different from a traditional form of organization. So there's another reading, is that it's not only important to use those forms because of technology, but even for language, because we are in a way now very few to save the language. To build towns is a language which needs to be taught and transferred, and in order to be used properly. Because it's not something you pick up just overnight and you suddenly design a traditional town because you think it's nice, because you like it. It's technique which needs to be learned.
Leon Krier, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you
for your lecture. And for our students and other Portuguese guests, tomorrow at 11 o'clock, we'll continue debate with Leon Krier.